Hello and welcome to the Scrum.org Community Podcast. I'm your host, Dave West, CEO here at Scrum.org. Today's podcast is part of our Agile Product Operating Model series. The focus of today's podcast is about portfolio management. In January, I presented a webinar on how portfolio management fits in to APOM. That webinar has created some quite interesting conversations about portfolio management and the like. And one of those sets of conversations was with one of our PSTs, Lucas Smith, who's joining us today. Lucas is a PST and an executive at Toyota Connected. Now, I know some of the listeners may already know this. I'm a big fan of cars, so apologies if Lucas and I accidentally start talking about cars. We're going to try not to today, and it's a bit of a challenge. So, but welcome to the podcast, Lucas.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
It's great to have you. Okay, so Toyota, hugely famous for building products. As you know, I look out my window and see two Toyota pickup trucks actually outside my window at the moment. You know, they also are very famous for creating many of the ideas that have led the next generation of management thinking in the 20th and 21st century. So I'm really interested on how they and you at Toyota Connected approach portfolio management. I mean, many of the organizations we talked to and many of the conversations I had after the webinar were very much like, this is incredibly challenging because it's bringing together, you know, money, effort, you know, all of the business strategy, everything in one place. And it's a sort of massive melting pot of pain for many organizations. So I'm sure Toyota are doing it really, really well. So tell me a little bit of how you manage your investments and your portfolio of products.
Well, that's a really good question, and I will also acknowledge that it is a very difficult challenge. It's a difficult challenge when you're just dealing with a web or an application that doesn't maybe have hardware and supply chains and things behind it. But it's even bigger challenge when you're dealing with a combination of a physical product that you're producing in multiple locations around the world, the supply chain with that, as well as the increasing complexity of software and the interconnectedness of vehicles. So that's really where our Toyota Connected has been focused, is around the connected vehicle, the complexities with that. So we don't cover everything. So I'll speak primarily to our area, but I think we've approached it in a couple different levels. So I think maybe for the purpose of this, we'll assume you have some sort of strategy, right? An organizational purpose, right? So that's kind of an assumption, because if you stray too far outside of your purpose, you kind of get lost and stuff doesn't work so well. So we'll ignore that big question, but it is a good question. So I think for us, the first level is really just trying to understand what your products are, right? That is ultimately a very key piece to this. And frankly, we have lots of discussions around what qualifies as a product, whether it's something a customer uses, whether it's something you can have internal teams using. I think of it as both, but in general, we think of a product as something that is long-lived, that we have to maintain, that we add things to. And we kind of have a rule of thumb. It's kind of a funny one, but if someone might call you and complain about it and be able to name it, it's probably a product. Right? There's a lot of things that go on under the scenes and under the hood that, you know, a customer might not see, and they might be a product, but really you think about some sort of packaging of those into something that's understandable for someone. So that's a rough rule of thumb. So I would say first we look at what are our products, and then I really do. I think some of the APOM material is that you pulled together is really correct in that understanding the life cycle and the funding of that product is really important. I would say the life cycle and the life stage of that product is really the next thing we look at. We tend to refer to things as either in an explore, extract, or explore, expand, extract, and end of life. So it's a little bit of that model, right? And each of those stages has some different characteristics to it. So within a big organization, right, it's hard to have a single funding stream, a single funding model that works for everything. So it's important to understand those distinctions, because if you're talking with finance or you're talking with your investment council or your approval board, if they're stuck in thinking about everything as like, this is an established product and we have to be very careful with it, that's a different funding, different approval thought process than something that's an exploratory that isn't an established product yet. So that's kind of an important life cycle. So I would quickly explain those as explore is something that you don't have a market for yet. You might, but you're trying to test it out, right? So the important thing about things in explore phase is to move quickly, to move, small team, small amount of funding, learn fast. You're not building something that's really polished, but you're trying to identify if this is really going to become something, if there's really a need there. If you do, now you really go into the expand phase, right? So expand is really where you want to put a lot of money, a lot of teams, and you're really trying to grow that, capture the market, capture the users, build something that gives you a competitive advantage. And so there's a clear investment reward return in an expand phase, right? You've made a case, you know that people want this, so you're investing in it. Once you have an established product, especially in big organizations, it becomes harder to think of that as something you want to take a lot of risks on, right? So now it moves a little bit more into what I would call an extract phase, right? It's an established product. You may not be changing tons of things about it, but you need to continue to invest in it. You need some sort of continuous stream, but you're thinking about, all the things about user costs, cost to operate, cost to maintain it, user engagement with it. But you're not going to necessarily make huge changes on that product without testing it or beta testing it or doing some sort of canary release, right? Just because the risk is a lot higher. And then at some point, right, it becomes end of life, or it's something that you don't care about investing as much in anymore because you don't think there's as much return. So maybe you have to keep the lights on. Maybe you have to maintain it, right, while people migrate to your new product, your new system, but you scale down your funding, you scale down that around it a lot. So that is kind of the base. Now, not everything fits so cleanly, right? But that's kind of the goal that we think towards, and it does really help to understand the purpose, the key metrics, the key value proposition of that product, right, in the market or internally, right? If you have something that's more of a platform, because they kind of follow a similar thing. So that's kind of our product, and then.
So can I just lean into that just for a second?
Yeah.
So ultimately, you fund products based on value and the stage they are in their life cycle and the amount of risk or reward, etc. And then you allow, because this is a fundamental idea really, and then you allow teams to determine the work based on strategy and business roadmaps and user needs and etc. etc. For your products, would you say, and I know it's never black and white completely, but generally that is a principle that you at Toyota Connected follow?
I would say that is our goal and principle that we attempt to follow. I would say I think the product base is really what we have gone for, because we believe that's where the value really is. In the size and the complexity of organization, we have aligned on some terminology. So I think it's really important to align on what you call a product and what isn't a product, right? Because that can determine the funding as well. So the life stage of a product kind of determines how you fund it, how you evaluate it, but not everything fits that product as cleanly as we would like, right? So we think of products, again, as something someone would use, that we want to have a continuous funding for, a mostly stable team. We have a clear market, users, we can gauge that. Above that, or separate from that, we refer to things as initiatives, right? So we like to keep things as simple as possible. So, a base initiative might be just something that okay, we're upgrading features for EV vehicles, for example, and that might affect a couple different products, right? There's got to be kind of a cohesive strategy there. If we can do it just with the product areas or business areas working directly with each other, that's great. But if it gets complicated enough, if it touches enough different products, or maybe it goes to multiple companies within Toyota or multiple suppliers, now you get a little bit of a different kind of structure to that. So we kind of do those in two flavors. One is what we call kind of a cross-product or cross-organization initiative. And that's something that might last 6 months to 2 years. It has a determined time span. We try to do that around giving a small initiative team. So we try to give a small initiative team ownership of that initiative for them to then work into the product areas. Oftentimes that initiative gets funding just because it's easier to understand. So we might get, okay, you get $10 million to upgrade for EV features. So then they would take that funding and say, okay, 5 million of that goes into the app, 2 million goes here. So they're hopefully dishing that out into the product areas. Now, if we get big enough, we have what we call a program. Our program is basically our multi-generational vehicle launches, right? And so that's something that encompasses on our scale probably 30 or 40 different separate products, maybe 40 different vendors who are building things or we're integrating things into that. Plus, you're trying to plan that for 20, 30 different factories around the world and different vehicle lines. So that is a pretty complicated structure. And we have our whole dedicated program team that manages that. So they are still defining things that they want to go into the products. So they're still pushing things towards the products, but we tend to fund those programs because they tie into vehicle sales for us. So that's just at least our world. I would certainly say, keep it as simple as you can. Don't add a lot of structure if you don't have to, because structure adds complexity. Then you get to all sorts of challenges with integration. Who's doing the testing? How are you actually integrating things? The dependencies across that. So for us, I mean, honestly, we have kind of a full-time team doing that for our vehicle programs. But on the life cycle, right, the base of it is, again, the products, and we build on top of that.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, because in the webinar, that's pretty much how we just, we didn't have the the program stuff. I didn't talk about that because the people I interviewed aren't quite of the scale of Toyota. There's very few companies in the world that are of the scale of Toyota. And cars are the most complicated machine that humanity mass produces. So I think it's very likely that layer is perhaps not necessary for many organizations. There are but a few that would. But the initiatives is interesting, because that's exactly what I saw at the 2 or 3 companies that I talked to in preparation for the webinar. That's exactly how they work as well. They fund the products, and then long-term teams allow them a level of autonomy around roadmaps and planning. And then there's these initiatives. In finance, it was GDPR and financial initiatives, around certain laws that are coming, and they push that. And if they get to a certain size, then they become initiatives with an initiative owner and maybe a team around them, which then drives that. So very, very, very similar. I think from how you described it. So, all right. So, and at the heart of the APOM approach is this idea of balancing agility with control, right? You really want empowered teams that are taking ownership for their products and feeling like they actually make decisions about what's going in them and are vested in it from a motivation perspective. But you need, obviously, that level of control, particularly if you're releasing the next generation of EVs or sports cars or whatever the new RAV4, whatever the things are that you're working to. You need that level of control and transparency. How does it, in practical terms, what does it how do you exert these two almost contradictory kind of like pools?
Yeah, I would say you put your finger on one of the key challenges, right? I would definitely agree with that. I think, I don't claim there's a one size fits all, right? It kind of does depend on your organization, what your risk profiles are, what your products are, et cetera, and your organization structure. So, I touched on our core goal of funding products. Um, Not everything is funded that way for us, right? So, one important thing we have done to help understand that control is just to do it's basically just a quadrant map of our current products or our current business areas and how they are funded, right? So the goal, right, is maybe your ideal dream is someone is paying for that product or you're getting funding directly into that product team, right? That gives them the most autonomy, right, and the most ability to quickly make changes to that product, right? So knowing how quickly and how critical it is that you can adapt that product, that would encourage you or be able to have discussions within your organization to say, look, we really need an independent stream that doesn't go through additional brutal chains, right, to this product team and allow them to adapt quickly. Some of our products are funded by external stakeholders within the organization. So we might have, so the first level that is our ideal is product funding directly to that team. Maybe second level is like a long-term funding structure, but we still have to work with stakeholders, right, to determine their needs, what they want integrated. So that's kind of we call that level one, level two. We currently, our goal is to get everything to level two, right, where we have a long-term products funding stream, but we at least have engagement within the enterprise. We have stakeholders. We know who we need to talk to, so that they're key, stakeholders and contributors to that. We do have things that operate more like a project funding, right? So we call that level three. So those are things that we have to go before approval board, right, and get funding for a certain amount of time, and we have to continually do that. So that gives more control to the organization, and a lot of times they feel better about that funding, but it means you have less adaptability, right, to change, and the team has less autonomy with that. And then level four, which is we try to avoid, but we do have some of this just because of our structure, is where we're just kind of doing staff aug, right? Where we are basically putting people into someone else's product team. So that's maybe a nuance of the corporate structure and the different companies within Toyota. But just mapping your products across those was actually a really powerful exercise for us. And it really just helps us to see, okay, what type of work, what type of products or funding do we take on? What's our goal? Can we get, this one is stuck in level three. Can we make a case to move to more consistent funding for this product because of the market needs? Or is it okay that it stays there? Like, it's not a big deal. So I think that was actually a really key exercise for us, and allowed us to have discussions internally and with different parts of Toyota to say, look, if you're telling us we really need to be innovative, we need to be adaptive, we need to change, or we need to catch up to the market in some way, then you have to fund it or structure it in a way that allows us to do that.
Yeah, and I actually think even though Toyota Connected is a unique entity inside Toyota, that actual model, maybe not the fourth one, but the 1, 2, 3 is very similar in most organizations actually. One is those products that there's definite money coming in. It's a financial product. It's it's something that people are buying or using or subscribing to, either as a shared revenue. That you get a slice of a bigger pie or whatever. Second one is ones that are internal systems that are very much have sponsorship and they're like, yes, we need to have this call center or we need to have this for a period, but the money's a little bit less direct. And then the third one are these projects. I was going to a consumer packaged goods organization a few weeks ago, and they fire up these, oh, we need an app that does this, whatever it is, something about diapers or something about whatever, women's health or whatever, and they create it. and then it doesn't really, and they fund it, and the team have very little. I mean, it's kind of like a bit, yeah, they try to be outcome centric, they try to be user centric, but at the end of the day, you're satisfying a stakeholder with a big pot of cash, and then so you deliver that, and then it's like, okay, so what happens? How do we maintain it? I was talking to actually last year, talking to a lady that works at the Dutch Natural History Museum, and she said, we're really good at those threes. And I've got like a million of, oh, the history of the dinosaur app, the app, or the, all of this stuff. She goes, nobody maintains them because they haven't moved it into two or one. And because of that, there's this thing. So it's funny. I think that model is actually incredibly universal, even though I'd not really thought about it until you shared it with me when we met in Orlando, what, 3 weeks ago or so, which is really interesting.
And you see that the structure, we're talking about it kind of in the agile product sense, but if you look at it from an organization perspective, what you're looking at is, do you have a profit and loss center? Do you have a P&L center as an organization that is getting revenue in for your product, making decisions about it? Or are you operating just as a cost center? A cost center now has to get approval to spend money from someone else. So that's kind of your level one, level two. And if you're a cost center, but someone else outside is deciding what they need to do and funding you, now you're a level three project, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the structure that a lot of people deal with, and I think it's okay to recognize that, right, and just plot it out. But there are trade-offs, right? There are trade-offs between each of those types of work.
Well, the biggest challenge that level three, from my experience from talking to people, have is the longevity element. You can't, technology, software doesn't die, you have to kill it. I hate to say that, and that's an awful analogy, but you really do. And so there's all these things sitting around that are no longer maintained adequately, or they're sort of maintained in the sort of hidden. I remember when I was working at Commercial Union 100 years ago, there was this one app that was never funded, but we always maintained it. And it was just, you just move those, because we had to do timesheets, and the time I spent on the app, I just put on my local project. And I know that was really awful, but somebody had to maintain it. It was an important app, right? But it just hadn't gone through. Yeah. And
it's the truth. Or you're every time you introduce a new project that you're getting funded, there's a cost, there's a buffer cost that you're adding to each of those to basically maintain everything else, right? And it's like, okay, your first app costs you $1 million. Well, your second one is 1.5. It really costs $1 million, but we need $500,000 just to maintain the old ones that you don't fund, right?
Exactly. And of course, that leads to massive amount of technical debt. It leads to, you not deployed the latest security patch. It leads to all of those disasters. There's been many an audit of an existing organization, and they found like 400 apps that nobody knew anything about. But that's just the way of the world, because we are a little bit like magpies. Oh, new shiny thing. Oh, new shiny thing. And that's the reason why I think your strategy of trying to get to at least two is admirable, because then you have a product roadmap, you have an operational roadmap, you have a value proposition in terms of an economic roadmap. I think that's really really important. You mentioned that some of these programs are incredibly complicated, particularly at the program level, so above initiative and above product. Dependencies. What happens with dependencies? Because the worst thing in the world from a product team is to be dependent on somebody else's roadmap. It just makes everything harder. How do you? I mean, you have OEMs. OEMs have OEMs. It's just. I was talking to BMW about 2 years ago, and they the number of variants that they have, and they showed me the sort of like the mathematical equation for variance in their system, and it was it took up the entire board. It was so complicated. What do you do at Toyota Connected? Because simplicity, it's a key premise of Toyota management system. And, you do a really good job of simplifying anything. How do you manage dependencies?
And that's that is a good question. So I'll try not to overload with too much because vehicle programs not everyone's dealing with, right? But
Yeah.
those are the worst, right? In terms of managing it. Um, from a base level, you're adding structure, minimal structure, right, as needed. We do find that some type of quarterly planning helps a lot. So a quarterly road mapping, high level features, discussion with dependent teams. So that helps a lot because that's kind of the level time wise that we're planning stuff out, right?
Yeah.
So visualizing that, doing quarterly planning with all of our teams, allowing time ahead of time to work and say, hey, we're going to be launching this feature here. What are the 3 things that are dependent on it? Let's get agreement from the different teams and timeline on that. That's kind of the base first level, right, between products. And we try to manage most of the things just product to product there. When you get to initiatives, right, initiatives kind of feed into those products. So it doesn't necessarily add a lot of dependencies other than what we can manage in quarterly planning. Program level, absolutely, right? To your point, we have maybe a supplier who's adding a new, we call it the head unit, is the dash unit in the vehicle, right? So we're designing a new one. They would be called our tier 1 supplier. They're a global company, Fortune 100 company. They're going to be building 10 million of these for us. But they have tier 2 supply. Two would be someone supplying them. Tier 3 would be someone supplying them, right? So those programs, especially because we're dealing with hardware, we have to plan out at kind of a 4 or 5 year cadence, right? So we know enough about building cars, right, that we know roughly how much time it takes, and we're adding buffers in. We're adding buffers between finalization of a physical product, finalization of a software product, integration points, right, before we go into pre-factory builds, right? So we do things like hand-built vehicles that we do testing on, right, before everything comes together. And then there's a couple months before that goes into a factory, right? So I would say that just depends on your risk, right? For us, stopping a factory is like millions of dollars a day, right? And when we build a product, it's got to go in there, it's got to work the first time. So we are willing to pay and have integration, pay for slower stuff ahead of time because of that risk.
Yeah.
Now, if you can standardize, right, like that is a key discussion for us, right? Is if you're changing your software underlying platform every time, or the processing chips on the vehicle every time, now you've lost, you have to redo a lot of stuff between your generation. So that's one thing, is minimize your complexity based on your scale. But then if you can create things for customers that create differentiation, but don't add a lot of complexity, right? So, frankly, Android and Apple have, this has been a challenge for them. Even screen size differences on devices means that your apps have to be redesigned. They have to be designed in a way that they scale and shrink and contract. So we have a huge vehicle line. We have all sorts of different screen sizes, but picking those screen sizes and standardizing on them or having a fixed set is one way to simplify, right? And then, so creating that or designing that from upfront and saying, look, we're not going to redesign the multimedia system between Corolla and between a Lexus, right? Like, we might brand it differently and we might have different touch and feel to it, or different sounds that make it sound more premium. But you're not, if you build a completely different software product for those, or you allow the organization or stakeholders to demand that, you've just duplicated your cost and maintenance. So you gotta pick what is core, and then but allow differentiation, because stakeholders in your company are always going to want that. If you've got multiple levels of brand, like we have a chief engineer for Corolla, right? And he argues with us if we want to increase the cost on something by 5 cents a vehicle, right? Because to him, that matters a lot. right?
Yeah.
Whereas, the Lexus LX, they're like, okay, yeah, we want you to add a couple dollars here because we want a more premium feel. We want a more premium thing. So how do you differentiate that? I think there's a lot of lessons. Apple is very good at that, right? And just a little bit of different screen size, a little bit of a different camera resolution, more storage space. Those are things that actually don't impact your software very much, but
Yeah.
they impact the user experience, which create a differentiation. So those are things, just increasing the size of your screen, increasing the resolution, maybe the speed of responsiveness, maybe the sounds, the touch and feel. We do spend a lot of time trying to think through how to manage reducing those number of permutations effectively.
I think the complexity thing is really interesting because obviously, I mean, Apple only releases once a year, really. Let's be honest. I mean, there are obviously small releases before that, but they've managed to persuade their customers to have a level of understanding that many of us could only dream about. And they have a sort of brand following in a different way. But then you look at like Tesla, the fact that when I got my Tesla, there was two different software platforms running. When they brought out the Y and my S were very different, right? Now it's all the same. They've consolidated, the screens are the same, everything's exactly the same, and people seem to be okay with it. But when a Lexus and a yeah, and a normal Toyota, as it were, it's very interesting. But reducing that complexity, I think, is crucial to managing that level of dependencies and deciding what core and context, what differentiates, what makes us special.
Yeah.
That's the key, right?
I think we actually talk about that layered model, right, from a expectations of updates, right? So Apple, they have, it's a good model because people think about it, right? It's like you've got the physical phone, right? That to us is sort of like our physical vehicle, right? Apple updates their phone every year. We
Yep.
update our vehicle every year, but we do major updates every 3 years.
Yep.
Then you have kind of your OS level, which is our firmware, our sensor management, right? Our vehicle platform. Apple might update that a couple times a year, right?
Yep.
We're on maybe a twice a year update for that, right? And only certain parts of it we can update. And we're trying to improve those different parts. But then on top of that, what the customers see are the app side, right?
Yeah.
Even though Apple isn't updating their OS or their phone, you get updates every day, every week, on the different apps, and that keeps you happy because you're like, oh, I got something new, I got a new feature, got a new thing. So those are things, we can update stuff from the vehicle. If something lives on the cloud, we can update that very quickly. So we
Yeah. Yeah.
build the voice assistant that runs on Toyota and Lexus, and we can add new skills, we can add new things behind the scenes on that very quickly. Now, if we're talking about modifying firmware on a sensor on the vehicle, now we've got much longer play because there's a lot more vendors, a lot more testing involved. Now, if we're talking about needing to add a new sensor to enable a new product, now that's multi-years. So
Yeah.
those time horizons are important to think about. And when you come up with new product ideas or new features, you have to know where those go. Can we manage this in the product? Or do we have to go to the vehicle platform team? Or do we have to get into the cycle ahead of time, several years out and say, look, we're thinking about one feature we just released. Actually, we did this ahead of Tesla, is the advanced rear seat reminder, where we've got like basically a millimeter wave radar in our Siennas that can detect heartbeats in back seats or in the trunk. And so if you leave a kid right in your car, it was kind of designed around the hot car
Yeah. Yeah.
problem. So that took us several years, right, from concept at a hackathon, where we could show, look, we know we can do this, but it's a new sensor, it's a new physical piece that's got to go in the vehicles. And so it's going to be multi-years, to get that into the production line, even though we can validate the product right now.
Oh wow. Well, and yeah, and I recommend that we do it because it'd be really good to not have these. Well, I'm not sure about kids being locked. I'm more worried about dogs actually, but that's the.
Yeah, either yeah,
No, I
either
do
one.
care about my
Yeah.
children, by the way, Lucas. I wasn't implying that I don't. They're just more vocal when they get locked in a car than my poor dog. Um,
There's a
uh,
smaller age range typically that they would not remind you, right? Like if you leave your
exactly.
4-year-old there, they're like, wait, like, but it
Exactly.
still happens. Unfortunately, it still happens. So
Yeah, it
it is a
does.
problem.
So it's great. That is a worthy cause. So just to take it all the way back, and we need to finish. And I could talk to you for hours about this stuff. I really love the whole. I mean, The Machine That Changed the World is one of my favorite books of all time because it just boggles the mind how we built cars and how we built the infrastructure around it, and the petrol stations, gas stations, and the freeways, and then the car manufacturers, and then it's just incredible. I think the story of automotive manufacturing is one of the most interesting things ever, and I'm definitely a, well, I guess what they called petrol head, but I guess actually I'm an electric and petrol head, so that's it. So I could talk for hours, but so just take it forward. What was very apparent from your conversation when you were talking about dependencies, Lucas, was that ultimately the selection of the products and the platforms and making those right choices about what is a platform, what is a product, and how do they fit together has everything about this.
Yes.
And you have to be very cognizant of your product architecture and continuously monitor it and ensure that it's giving you that flexibility, time to market, and that value that you seek. Is that a challenge? Because it must be really hard to change those product boundaries, even if it makes sense to do so when you've got this machine running continuously around it.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And I think if every time you have to add a new feature to a product, you're dependent on someone else, maybe that's a sign you should at least evaluate those boundaries. Now,
Yeah.
maybe there's two things you need to evaluate. One is your horizontal boundaries, right? If every time you're adding a button or a widget or something, you're dependent on someone else and change, we'll say this, you're dependent on changes from someone else,
Yeah, they're
then
roadmap.
you either need to look at that boundary or you need to look at how you've done the technical interfacing between those layers, right? So
Yeah.
again, we'll go back to a simple model with the apps on your phone. Apple has the OS level has made a number of different calls and API calls and calls to different sensors and getting different data. Like that platform, like every time you add a new feature to an app, you don't have to change the platform, right? You rely on it being there and you make changes to it. So just because we change an app doesn't mean we don't have to use something else that someone has provided or a different platform. But if every time we require changes on them, then maybe it's a sign we either haven't drawn the boundaries right, or technically we haven't exposed the right level of abstraction from that
Yeah.
platform that is usable, right? So I would say keep track of those things, right? Any time you have a cross area dependency, it's at least something to look at, right? Do you need to change your boundary? Is this something that we need to abstract better for our APIs between different products or between platforms and products? Or is this really just something we can't solve just based on this touches all the different layers of our product and all goes all the way from a physical thing, right? I'm not going to change the boundaries of my product just because I need a new sensor on the vehicle. Like
Yeah.
that's a physical thing, right? That if we don't have a radar in the car, there's no way I could do that product, right? I'm going to have to require that. So there's some things that are always going to hit that, but
Yeah.
it's definitely worth evaluating and keeping track of that and saying, okay, do we have the right horizontal boundaries from a product standpoint, or do we have the right kind of technical structure that enables our products without too many dependencies on others?
Yeah. Makes sense. Oh, I could talk all day. I learned so much from talking to you, Lucas. Thank you for taking the time today. I know our listeners are going to be so thrilled to. I mean, Toyota's obviously famous in our world, right? And coupled with actually the practical lessons of how you deliver product in a very complicated environment. I love the four different sort of funding sort of models, as it were. I love the, and what that has, that implication on autonomy. I thought it was really interesting. It all starts with the definition of product, and managing those dependencies is a key characteristic that you just mentioned again there. I think that's super crucial. And at the end of the day, it's about balancing agility with control, and how you do that, I think, is super interesting. So thanks for taking the time. And
Yeah, absolutely. It was great to talk to you. And if I have a last word, I would just say anyone working in complex systems, like, just understand that there are other people who are experiencing the same things. To accomplish sometimes huge and great things, like, require complexity, right? So it's something you have to embrace. There are always trade-offs. There's no perfect 100% answer to everything. But the fact that you have an opportunity to build something, especially if it can impact people's lives and make a difference, even if it's a little slower than you would like sometimes, that's a great place to be, and a great opportunity you have.
that's great. That's sage type words, Lucas. Be mindful of the system that you're building, and ensure it makes it transparent, but also understand that we're doing this to deliver value, which is an incredible opportunity that we all have in the industries and the jobs that we do. So thanks for your time, Lucas. I'll let you get back to building that next generation of car, which I can't wait to hear more about, but we'll take that offline, and we'll have it over a beer sometime in the future. And listeners, thank you for listening to today's Scrum.org Community Podcast. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe, share with friends, and of course, come back and listen to some more. I'm lucky enough to have a variety of guests talking about everything in the areas of professional Scrum, product thinking, and of course, Agile. Today we had Lucas Smith, PST and executive at Toyota Connected, talking about the Agile Product Operating Model with particular focus on portfolio planning, and how an organization as innovative and with so much history and so much scale that Toyota has, is actually working in a very agile and creative way. So thanks for listening, everybody. Scrum on.